Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Knight Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk. I'm Hugh Taylor, CEO at Road Knight Taylor, and for those of you who don't know us yet, we're the independent specialist grid consultancy, and our Connectologists help a roll call of the UK's leading developers and investors in commercial, industrial and energy developments to significantly outperform their peers, as well as helping intensive energy users to get the connections they need to decarbonise their operations, and public sector clients striving to enable economic and housing growth. Today we're talking about tertiary connections. The dash for transmission started really with the developer community seeking these specific connection opportunities, and a lot are now being secured and transacted. Given these are always idiosyncratic connections, I'm joined today by Pete Aston to discuss what a development director or investment director should know about them. Pete is one of Road Knight Taylor's Connectologists and joined us last year from Western Power Distribution, now National Grid Electricity Distribution, where he headed up the system planning function. So he was responsible for all connections to the extra high voltage network or impacting on the extra high voltage network across all four of WPD's licence areas, responsible for some 500 connection offers going out each year. And he, very importantly, was also responsible for the relationship with National Grid across the distribution transmission boundary at each of WPD's grid supply points. So, Pete, welcome. Good. And so I thought I would just start, let's start things very simply by asking you, what is a tertiary connection?
Right. Yes, it's definitely the first thing to try and dig into. So the tertiary connection is really a connection onto a transformer. Most transformers have what are called windings. So sort of windings of copper cables around an iron core. So there's generally a primary winding, the high voltage side coming in, and a secondary winding, the lower voltage side coming out the other side. And the whole idea of a transformer is changing voltage from one side to the other. A tertiary connection is simply a third winding on a transformer. This ends up getting used for various different things. So on National Grid's transformers, so typically 400 kV to 132 kV transformers, called supergrid transformers, there is often a third winding, a tertiary winding on those transformers. So that's essentially what a tertiary winding is. Connections to those tertiary windings on those supergrid transformers are sort of generically referred to as tertiary connections. So that's what we're talking about. It's a connection to a transformer that is owned by National Grid. The maximum rating that you can normally get from one of those tertiary connections is about 60 MVA. That is the absolute limit. So you'll see most tertiary connections are sort of 50 megawatts, 55 megawatts, capped at then 60 MVA.
Great, thanks. And I should mention that you have actually written a great blog explaining what a tertiary connection is. So we'll put a link to that in the description as well. So thank you very much for that. That was very clear. And so so they're obviously very popular, but what are the advantages of these tertiary connections?
So I think the reason that so many tertiary connections were sort of explored in the first place was because there's lots of availability. There's hundreds and hundreds of supergrid transformers around the country, so lots of options sort of right the way across the country. So I think that's one positive to it, that there's lots of opportunities to connect into them. I think one of the main advantages of a tertiary connection is the consistency of the solution that you can find. So connecting into any tertiary winding of a supergrid transformer, you're going to get pretty much the same solution. So for developers who are looking to connect into tertiary windings, that they can pretty much get one sort of standard set of designs drawn up, and they know what they're going to get. They're going to get common costs for each of these connections. So I think that is the main advantage of the tertiary windings is around that consistency piece and commonality.
And there has been an awful lot of activity around these. So just how many are there, both in terms of tertiary connections that are connected, but also in the development pipeline where they've accepted connection offers from National Grid?
Yeah, so in terms of connected numbers, there really isn't very many tertiary windings actually connected at the moment. It's in the region of 3 to 5 tertiary connections have already been made across the country. So really not very many. So there's not a lot of experience out there as to how these are done. But in the pipeline, there's maybe in the order of something like 150 tertiary windings out there that have been accepted by developers and that are being waiting to be developed, to be built. Some of them will be going through the planning process. Some of them will just be sitting there with capacity being held. So if there's about 150 in the pipeline and each of them are about 50 megawatts, that's 7,500 megawatts worth of capacity, 7.5 gigawatts worth of capacity sitting there in accepted offers for tertiary winding connections. So it's quite significant.
That is absolutely huge. And obviously there are some very famous ones. Pivot Power have connected their 50 megawatt battery, which I think they've got an EV charging hub, and they're hanging some other technologies off there as well. And that's Oxford. And so there are some of these that are actually being developed. And, it's an exciting development, I guess, in its own way. But you have actually highlighted that there are some challenges associated with these connections. So what are the main issues with tertiary connections?
The first one to highlight is really around constraints. So a tertiary winding connection is obviously made, as I was describing a bit earlier, into a supergrid transformer. So anytime that supergrid transformer goes off supply, so that could be for regular maintenance every year, could be for a fault, something along those lines, that tertiary connection becomes unavailable. Now that could be quite significant. Maintenance for supergrid transformers, is definitely in the many days every year. It could be weeks, a few weeks worth of maintenance for a long maintenance period. If a supergrid transformer happened to fault, getting a replacement supergrid transformer could take easily 6 to 12 months. So the risk of long-term outage is quite significant. So that's on the simplest of the tertiary winding connections.
Good stuff, Pete. Thank you. Let's pick that back up straight after this.
If you're liking this podcast so far, you may want to pop over to the Connectology page on Road Knight Taylor's website and sign up to the Connectology newsletter for much more know-how, insight and thought leadership in electricity network connections. The link to this is in the description. Don't miss out on any of the articles, explainers, videos, webinars and podcasts that Road Knight Taylor's Connectologists share to give you an edge and help you overcome your grid frustrations.
As they get more complex, some of these tertiary winding connections are actually connected into supergrid transformers, which are themselves connected into circuits, transmission circuits, so 400 or 275 kV circuits. And anytime those circuits then trip off, they will also trip off the supergrid transformer as well. So your risk is not just then associated with the supergrid transformer, but with the circuit. And so circuits can be prone to things like lightning strikes and so on. So you can get some more risk on those. And then it can get even worse still, whereby you're not sort of physically tripped off for an outage of something that you're connected to, but if something else, some other asset in the substation gets tripped off or gets switched out, you will just be turned off, because what National Grid will have modelled is that if one of the other transformers in the substation is switched out, you have to be switched out as well, just because of capacity issues. So some of these, and this isn't just hypothetical. We've looked at done sort of due diligence work for developers and looked at these connections for them. And this is the sort of thing that we're seeing on some of these offers that have come through. So some of them have got quite high risks associated with them. So that's the main one, is really around the constraints. Second one's around cost. The cost of a tertiary winding connection that's offered by National Grid is currently around 3.5 million. And as we all know, prices are only on the rise at the moment. So for that £3.5 million, all you get is a connection to the tertiary winding plus a step-up transformer. So these tertiary windings are kick out the voltage at 13 kV. So what you need is a step-up transformer to go from 13 kV 1.3 up to 33 kV, and then that's it. That's what you get for your 3.5 million. So it's quite a lot. And then on top of that, you've got to add on your 33 kV cable route. So it's okay if your site is right next door to a grid supply point where these transformers are, but if you've got any significant length of cable, you're going to add on top of that 3.5 million. So costs can ramp up quite significantly with these, and also if you can't actually deliver your full 50 megawatts on your site, so for example you don't get planning permission for all of the solar you wanted to install or all of your battery system or whatever, and your megawatts come down, your pounds per megawatt value suddenly starts to creep up quite quickly. So they're the first two, constraints and costs. Next would be just highlighting the fact that when you connect into a tertiary winding, you have a transmission connection. So even though it's only at 33 kV, you actually have a transmission connection. So you have to sign up to the balancing mechanism, and you end up paying transmission network user system charge to NUOS. So some of those things can be quite useful to sort of have that access to the transmission markets, but also can be quite costly as well. I think the fourth thing to highlight would be build timescales. So obviously you are relying on National Grid to do the work for you. So even though the voltage of the work's only 13 kV and 33 kV, it's happening within a 400 kV substation. So it can take National Grid quite a long time to program the work in, and just take them a long time to actually deliver the work as well. So that can be quite significant. And then it's just worth pointing out ownership as well. National Grid end up retaining ownership of the 13 to 33 kV step-up transformer. So that transformer needs to be to their specification, which is one of the reasons why it ends up being a very expensive connection. And then I think the last thing to mention is just around third-party works. So you're connecting as a tertiary winding connection into National Grid's network, but what National Grid will have to do is look to see if there are any third parties who are impacted by your connection. The main third parties who are impacted by tertiary connections will be distribution network operators, DNOs. So normally National Grid will have to have some sort of consultation process with DNOs to see whether your tertiary connection is going to affect capacity on the DNO network. And then to work through that, and there could be times when you actually end up triggering works on the DNO network as well. So that is definitely worth something to just bear in mind. So I think, Hugh, they are the main things to highlight in terms of sort of constraints and issues.
That's quite comprehensive, and there are obviously quite a number of risks in there. If we just go back to that outage risk, and you mentioned that if there are multiple assets, so multiple supergrid transformers within a grid site, that potentially you could be out if there's an outage or some maintenance work on another transformer. So a couple of things. First of all, how many of these supergrid transformers do you tend to get on a single site? And also, is there any way of actually estimating the level of outage risk in order that, so when we're carrying out due diligence, for example, for somebody who's looking to acquire a site, so they can get a really good bead, we know that there is an issue, but can you help them to actually understand that level of risk?
Yeah, okay, so to deal with your first question, so how many transformers are there often on these sites? Typically, grid supply points will have somewhere between 2 and 4 transformers. you'll find the odd few grid supply points with one transformer and a few with 5 or 6 transformers, but the 2 to 4 mark tends to be the average. So one of the schemes we did end up looking at was at a site where there were 4 transformers, and there was an outage risk for that tertiary connection in relation to each of those 4 transformers. So that was quite significant. And then in assessing the impact, the thing that we would do is to look at sort of average times of maintenance to start with, and go, there's sort of a regular annual maintenance, and then there'll be a more major maintenance once every 3 years, and they've got different sort of time periods as to how long those maintenance periods take, and so you can sort of give a sense by adding up some of those regular outage periods to say, well, at the very least, your risk over a 3-year maintenance cycle would be X days or weeks.
Sure. So you can look at that cumulative risk across each of the supergrid transformers on that one site.
That's right. So looking at the cumulative risk, and then, like I said, if there are circuits connected, or the supergrid transformers are connected to circuits, that gets a little bit more complex, because you then have to be looking at, well, how often is that circuit going to be switched out on a regular basis? Things like tower painting happen, reconductoring, where the old conductors are taken down and new ones are put up. All that sort of thing needs to be factored into these sorts of calculations. So we can give clients sort of a general sense of that, and in collaboration with National Grid come up with some sensible numbers as to what that really looks like, realistic numbers. And I think that's really important before a developer comes to invest in a project like this.
Sure, absolutely, because they are very significant investments. Listen, Pete, that was really good. That was really clear. Thank you very much for answering those questions and sharing that with us. And we look forward to your next podcast, which is coming up very soon. So thank you so much for that.
No problems. Thanks you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttaylor.co.uk, link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Road Knight Taylor connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadnighttaylor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you too.